You know that feeling where you wake up and the anxiety is already there before you've done anything to deserve it. Before you've checked your phone, before you've spoken to anyone, before the day has had a single chance to go wrong. It's just there, sitting on your chest like something you forgot to finish, except you can't remember what it is. You tell yourself it's normal, everyone feels this way, and you're partly right. But here's what doesn't get said. The generation born between 1997 and 2012 is carrying levels of anxiety, depression, and psychological distress that are genuinely, measurably, historically unprecedented. Not because they're weak, not because they can't handle reality, but because of the very specific reality they were handed to grow up inside. And that reality is almost nothing like what anyone outside it fully understands. Picture this. You're 11 years old, maybe 12, and somewhere in that window, a device arrives in your hand that is connected to every other person you've ever met, every opinion anyone has ever had about you, every version of a life that is allegedly better than yours, every piece of breaking news about a world that seems to be ending in at least 3 different ways simultaneously. And nobody sits you down and explains what that does to a brain that isn't finished developing yet. Nobody tells you that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for regulating emotion, assessing risk, separating what matters from what doesn't, won't be fully online until you're 25. Nobody tells you that you are handing a live wire to a system that doesn't yet know how to hold it. You just grew up in it, the way a fish grows up in water, without being able to name what the water is or what it's doing to you. And that's only the beginning, because Gen Z didn't just get the internet. They got the internet during a period of accelerating global instability that no previous generation had experienced in quite this combination. A financial crisis that reshaped their parents' sense of security. A climate conversation that told them regularly that the physical world they would inherit was in serious trouble. A pandemic that arrived right in the middle of the developmental years that are supposed to feel most alive. Adolescence, early adulthood, the years when you're supposed to be figuring out who you are by being around other people. They figured out who they were in their bedrooms, alone with a screen. Psychologist Jean Twenge, who has spent years tracking generational mental health data, identified something striking when she looked at the numbers. Rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicidal ideation among teenagers began a sharp and measurable rise right around 2012. Not gradually over decades, sharply, suddenly. Right around the year, smartphones became ubiquitous among adolescents. That timing is not a coincidence. What social media specifically does to the developing brain is something researchers are still fully mapping, but the core mechanisms are increasingly clear. The first is social comparison at scale and speed. Human brains are wired to compare themselves to the people immediately around them. That's a feature, not a bug. It helped our ancestors calibrate their place in a social group. But that calibration system was designed for a village of maybe 150 people, not for a feed of 4 billion. When you are 14 years old and your social comparison system is running against a curated highlight reel of every peer, every stranger, every filtered version of a life you don't have, the system doesn't recalibrate. It just keeps running and running and running, producing conclusions about your own adequacy that the original hardware was never designed to generate at that volume. The second mechanism is what researchers call the dopamine loop. Social media platforms are engineered around the same intermittent reinforcement schedule that make slot machines so compelling. Post something. Wait, did anyone like it? Check again. The uncertainty is the addiction. The brain learns to treat social validation the same way it treats food or safety, as a resource it must constantly monitor and pursue. And the third mechanism, the one that gets talked about least, is what happens to your sense of identity when it forms in a public space. For every generation before Gen Z, identity formation was relatively private. You tried things out. You changed your mind. You were embarrassing. You grew. And the record of all of that faded naturally. Gen Z formed their identities in front of an audience. Every opinion held publicly. Every change of mind documented. Every phase of figuring out who you are held permanently in a searchable record. That is a fundamentally different psychological environment than any generation before them navigated. And it changes how identity feels. It makes it feel like a performance that must be maintained rather than a self that is allowed to evolve. And that explains so much about how Gen Z actually moves through the world. Take their relationship with anxiety itself. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with a widespread vocabulary for mental health. They know what anxiety is. They know what trauma responses look like. They know the language of therapy, of nervous system dysregulation, of attachment styles. They are, on average, more psychologically literate than any generation before them. But here is the complicated part. Naming something and resolving it are different things. Knowing the word for anxiety doesn't make the anxiety quieter. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, having a framework for your pain can make it easier to stay inside the pain rather than move through it. The map and the territory are not the same thing. Then there is their relationship with the future, and this one is heavy. Every generation grows up with some version of uncertainty about what's ahead. But Gen Z grew up being told, in measurable and specific terms, that the systems they were inheriting were failing. Economic mobility declining, climate projections worsening, political polarization deepening, institutional trust collapsing. The message received, repeatedly in explicit terms, was that the future is less than the present. That maintenance is the best realistic outcome. That ambition itself might be a form of delusion. Psychologists call the psychological response to this kind of chronic low-level threat anticipatory grief. It's the grief you feel for something that hasn't been lost yet, but that you've been told, convincingly, with data, is likely to be. It sits differently to ordinary anxiety. It doesn't spike and subside. It hums, quietly, underneath everything. And it shapes how Gen Z relates to ambition, to planning, to commitment. Not because they don't care, but because caring too much about something that might not be there is a particular kind of risk that their psychology has learned to hedge against. There's something else worth naming. Gen Z is the most socially aware generation in recorded history. They have grown up with unprecedented access to the suffering of the world. Not filtered through a nightly news broadcast that ends at 10. Constantly, in real time, in high definition, every injustice, every crisis, every disaster landing directly in their pocket while they're still in their school uniform. The human capacity for empathy was not designed for that bandwidth. And when empathy is stretched across more suffering than one person can meaningfully respond to, it doesn't expand infinitely. It either exhausts itself or it numbs. Both are survival responses. Neither is a character flaw. Now here's the part that would be a disservice to leave out, because there is a shadow side to this, and it would be dishonest not to name it. The same psychological literacy that makes Gen Z more self-aware than any previous generation can also, in some cases, become a way of explaining behavior without changing it. Naming a trauma response is not the same as working through it. Identifying a pattern is not the same as interrupting it. There is a version of psychological awareness that functions more like a comfortable story about why things are hard than a genuine tool for making them less so. And the anxiety itself carries its own secondary costs. Avoidance, which feels like protection, often makes anxiety worse over time. The research on this is consistent and not complicated. The things we avoid to protect ourselves from fear tend to become larger in the avoiding of them. The world outside the bedroom, outside the familiar, outside the controlled environment of a screen, does not get less frightening by being avoided. It gets more so. And there is something worth saying about the identity formed in public. Gen Z is the first generation that has to actively learn how to change their mind without it feeling like a betrayal of who they said they were. How to grow in front of an audience without the record of every earlier version becoming a cage. That is genuinely hard work that no previous generation had to do quite in this way, and not everyone is doing it. But here is what gets lost in every lazy take about Gen Z being fragile, or soft, or unable to cope. They are the first generation to have grown up with no hiding place. Every anxiety visible, every fear documented, every uncomfortable moment of figuring out who you are happening in front of an audience that has opinions about it in real time. And they're still here, still forming opinions, still caring about things, still showing up for each other in ways that their own data says are happening at higher rates than almost any generation measured. Gen Z volunteers more, reports more willingness to discuss mental health with peers, shows higher rates of civic engagement among its younger members than the same age cohort of any generation in the past 40 years. They are not soft. They are sensitive to a world that has given them a great deal to be sensitive about. That is not a weakness. It is an accurate reading of the situation. The anxiety is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of perception, of a generation that has been paying attention, closely, without being able to look away, and carrying that weight while also trying to build something worth living inside of. That is not nothing, that is extraordinary. There's a particular cruelty in being told you're anxious about the wrong things, in having your fear diagnosed as a character defect by people who grew up in a quieter world and mistake that quietness for strength. Gen Z didn't choose the world they were handed. They didn't choose to form their identities under public scrutiny. They didn't choose to inherit the specific combination of crises that arrived during the years their brains were still being built. They didn't choose to have the world's suffering delivered to their pocket before they were ready to hold it. They grew up anyway, inside all of that, with the anxiety running in the background like an application that can't be closed. Learning to function alongside it. Learning to build relationships and form values and make decisions in conditions that no psychology textbook had fully anticipated. Every generation is a product of what the world asked of them before they were ready. Gen Z was asked for a particular kind of endurance, quiet, constant, and largely invisible to the people who weren't inside it. The fact that it shows that the anxiety is visible, that the struggle is named, that this generation refuses to pretend the difficulty isn't real, isn't weakness. It might be the most honest thing any generation has done in a very long time. If this resonated with you, if you recognize something in here, please subscribe.